It was late, and the chill of the night had settled into my bones as I made my way back from the gym. The streets were almost deserted, the occasional car passing by with its headlights slicing through the darkness. My muscles ached pleasantly from the workout, and I found a certain peace in the quiet solitude of the late hour. To save time, I decided to cut through a narrow alley that ran between two rows of abandoned buildings. The alley was poorly lit, with just a few flickering streetlights casting feeble pools of light onto the cracked pavement. I hesitated for a moment at the entrance, peering into the shadowy passage ahead, but brushed aside my unease. It was just an alley, after all. I had walked through here dozens of times without any trouble. But tonight felt different. About halfway down the alley, I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a pile of rags discarded on the sidewalk, but as I drew closer, I realized it was a person lying there. My heart skipped a beat, and I stopped in my tracks. The figure was still, almost too still, yet something in the air around him seemed wrong. There was a strange heaviness, a thick, oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. I cautiously approached, calling out, "Hey, are you okay?" There was no response, and as I came closer, I saw that the man wasn't unconscious. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly up at the sky. His lips trembled, as if he were struggling to speak. "Help me," he whispered, barely audible. His voice was raspy, like it had been scraped across sandpaper. I knelt beside him, feeling a rush of adrenaline surge through me. "What happened? Did someone attack you?" I asked, glancing around nervously, but the alley was empty. The man's hand shot up and gripped my arm with surprising strength. "No, not someone. Something," he rasped, his eyes glinting with a feverish fear. It came out of nowhere, like a mist, a dark, cold vapor. It had no shape, no form. It was a spirit, a wicked spirit. His voice broke, and he coughed violently, his grip tightening. "A spirit?" I repeated, incredulity creeping into my voice. "Are you sure? Maybe it was just smoke from a—" "No," he interrupted, his voice rising in panic. "It was not smoke. It was alive. It moved with purpose. It latched onto me. I could feel it inside, like it was sucking the life out of me." His voice trailed off as he struggled to catch his breath. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine, but I tried to keep my voice steady. Okay. We need to get you to a hospital," I said, pulling out my phone to call for help. But before I could dial, the man's grip suddenly slackened, and his eyes rolled back in his head. He fell limp, unconscious. I glanced around the alley again, half expecting to see some sign of the thing he spoke of, but there was nothing, just the cold night air and the distant hum of traffic. A sense of dread hung in the air, though, as if the darkness itself was alive, watching me. As I punched in the emergency number, I felt a sudden chill sweep through the alley, colder than the night air should have been. I looked up, and that's when I saw it. A dark mist, barely visible, hovering near the far end of the alley. It seemed to swirl and writhe, almost as if it were aware of me. I could feel it watching, though it had no eyes. The phone slipped from my hand, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. There was a faint whisper in the air, a voice I couldn't quite hear, like the murmur of distant conversation. I took a step back, my mind screaming at me to run, but my legs refused to move. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the mist seemed to shrink away, dissolving into the night. I blinked, and it was gone, as if it had never been there at all. But the oppressive heaviness in the air remained, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I glanced back at the man on the ground. His chest rose and fell slowly. He was still alive. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened here, something far beyond a simple attack. It was as if a part of the darkness itself had come alive, and I had witnessed only the beginning. The paramedics arrived within minutes. I watched numbly as they lifted the man onto a stretcher, his limp body a stark contrast to the bright flashing lights that cut through the darkness. One of the paramedics asked me a few questions, how I found him, whether I saw anyone else around. I tried to explain, but the words came out jumbled, and when I mentioned the mist, I could see the doubt in their eyes. It was probably smoke, one of them said dismissively. Could be from a nearby chimney or a vent. I nodded, not bothering to argue. How could I explain what I saw or thought I saw, when it didn't make sense even to me? Still, the sensation of being watched lingered, like a shadow that wouldn't fade away. After the ambulance pulled away, I found myself standing alone again in the alley. I couldn't bring myself to walk back the way I'd come, so I took the long route home, sticking to well-lit streets, my eyes darting nervously to every flicker of movement or shift in the wind. The memory of the dark mist wouldn't leave me, and an inexplicable sense of dread settled in the pit of my stomach. When I finally reached my apartment, I felt an overwhelming relief wash over me, as if crossing the threshold had broken some unseen spell. I locked the door behind me and double-checked the windows. The silence inside was comforting, a stark contrast to the oppressive quiet of the alley. I turned on every light in the place, as if to chase away the remnants of the darkness that seemed to cling to me. But sleep didn't come easily that night. I kept replaying the man's words in my head. A wicked spirit. The rational part of me wanted to dismiss it as delirium, or maybe a drug-induced hallucination. But there was a small voice whispering in the back of my mind that something far more sinister was at play. The next morning, I couldn't shake the urge to find out more about what had happened. I called the local hospital to check on the man's condition, giving them the approximate time and location I found him. After being transferred to a couple of different departments, I finally reached someone who could help. We have a patient matching that description, the nurse confirmed. He was brought in last night, found unconscious in an alley just like you said. His condition is stable now, but her voice trailed off, a note of hesitation creeping in. But what? I pressed, feeling my pulse quicken. There's something strange, she continued. He keeps mumbling about the darkness, saying it's still coming for him. We've sedated him, but he's been having these episodes, like nightmares, but while he's awake. He becomes hysterical, says it's trying to take him again. Frankly, we're not sure what to make of it. I hung up the phone, my skin prickling with goosebumps. His words echoed in my mind, intertwining with the memory of the mist. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he had encountered in that alley wasn't finished with him, or me. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I decided to revisit the scene in daylight. Maybe I'd find some explanation that would put my mind at ease. A leaky gas pipe, a chemical spill, something rational. But as I made my way back to the alley, I couldn't help but feel a gnawing sense of dread. The alley looked different in the light of day, less threatening, but no less desolate. The cracked pavement and crumbling brick walls seemed even more decayed, as though they had aged years in just one night. I scanned the ground, looking for anything unusual. Discolored patches, unusual debris. Anything that might explain the strange mist. My eyes fell on a small, blackened patch near where the man had been lying. The asphalt was scorched as if by fire, but there were no signs of an actual burn. No melted plastic or charred wood. Just a dark stain about the size of a person. I crouched down to examine it, and as I did, a sudden wave of cold washed over me, colder than the brisk autumn air. The feeling returned. The same heaviness I'd felt the night before, pressing down on me. I could almost sense something moving in the shadows, like a subtle shift in the air. I took a step back, and as I did, a faint whisper seemed to drift past my ear. It was too quiet to understand, like a breath just out of reach, but it sent a chill straight through me. I quickly turned and left the alley, my heart racing. There was no logical explanation for what I had felt. And as I walked away, I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being followed. Not by someone, but by something. The whisper had seemed almost familiar. As soon as I sensed that familiar whisper brushing against my ear, panic surged through me, cold and undeniable. The sensation of being watched clawed at me, as though invisible eyes bore into my back. My surroundings blurred as I ran. Streetlights and graffiti-covered walls streaked by, swallowed up by the gathering twilight. I didn't stop until I reached a busy main road, where cars and pedestrians seemed to ground reality back into place. My lungs burned, and my legs ached from the sudden burst of exertion, but I kept moving. I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness still lingered, trailing behind me. Each shadow that flickered in my peripheral vision made me flinch, and even the harmless night breeze seemed to carry a hint of menace. I swore I could still hear that faint whisper, fading in and out, taunting me with its incomprehensibility. I didn't know what I had encountered in that alley, but I wasn't about to find out. Whatever was lurking in that place was beyond my understanding, and I had no intention of ever confronting it again. I resolved then and there that I would never walk that route again. From now on, I'd stick to the safest, most well-lit streets, even if it took me twice as long to get home. As I reached my apartment building, I rushed inside, my hands shaking as I fumbled with my keys. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it securely before slumping to the floor. The comforting glow of the hallway light cast away some of the fear that gripped me, but not all. The darkness had followed me. It was out there, somewhere biding its time. I felt it deep in my gut, an unshakable certainty. For weeks, I avoided the area altogether. Even the thought of passing by that alley during the day made my skin crawl. I refused to take any shortcuts, even if it meant extending my walks by 15 or 20 minutes. Every night, I went straight home, glancing over my shoulder more often than I cared to admit. But the more I tried to push the memory away, the more persistent it became. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, feeling as though the darkness was in the room with me. I kept hearing faint whispers in the quiet hours before dawn, just barely audible, like a distant conversation I couldn't quite make out. And worse, there were times when I could swear I saw the mist again, lingering at the edges of my vision. I'd turn to face it, but there would be nothing there, just an ordinary shadow or a trick of the light. Despite my precautions, the dread followed me, creeping into my life like a slow poison. The nightmares began about a month after that night in the alley. At first, they were fragmented and surreal, visions of an impenetrable darkness swallowing me whole, or a faceless figure standing over my bed. But soon, the dreams took on a chilling consistency. Every night, I found myself back in that alley, the air heavy and suffocating. The dark mist would emerge from the shadows, curling toward me with a malevolent intelligence. I would hear whispers, not like the faint murmurs I'd heard before, but clearer, louder, like voices speaking directly into my mind. "You can't escape," they said, their tones weaving together in a dreadful chorus. "You belong to us now." I would wake up with a start, my heart racing, and find myself drenched in cold sweat. Sleep became a source of terror rather than rest, and I dreaded the approach of nightfall. The dark circles under my eyes grew deeper with each passing day, and my nerves were always on edge, as if anticipating an attack that never came. The worst part wasn't the dreams themselves. It was the feeling that they were more than just dreams. It was as though the darkness was reaching out to me, trying to draw me back to the place where it had first touched my life. I felt an almost irresistible pull toward the alley, a compulsion that frightened me as much as the nightmares themselves. But I refused to give in. I couldn't allow myself to return to that place, no matter how strong the urge. I started leaving all the lights on in my apartment, hoping that the brightness would somehow banish the darkness, or at least keep it at bay. But the whispers continued, invading my waking hours, though faint and elusive. Felt like they were calling me, beckoning me back to where it all began. As time passed, the nightmares gradually began to lose their grip on me. At first, they still came every night, but with each passing week, the darkness that haunted my dreams seemed to fade. The alley appeared less frequently in my sleep, and when it did, it felt distant and unreal, like a vague memory rather than a vivid nightmare. Eventually, the whispers that had once filled my ears with dread became nothing more than echoes, faint and harmless. Though the dreams never fully disappeared, they lost the power to terrify me. I would wake up in the night with only a hazy recollection of the mist and the darkness, as if they were stories someone else had told me long ago. During the day, I no longer felt that suffocating heaviness or the prickling sensation of being watched. Life slowly returned to normal. I hadn't forgotten that night in the alley. I doubted I ever would, but I learned to live with the memory. I no longer felt the need to share it with others or dwell on it in my thoughts. It had become a part of my past, a strange and unsettling experience, but one that didn't define me. I found peace in routine, and as long as I avoided that part of town, I could go about my life without looking over my shoulder. I never took that shortcut again. The mere idea of setting foot in that alley still stirred an unease deep inside me, but it was easy enough to avoid. There were other routes, safer and brighter, and I stuck to them without hesitation. In time, the fear melted away, leaving behind a quiet acceptance. Whatever had happened in that alley remained a mystery, but it no longer haunted me. It was just a story I told myself sometimes, a reminder of a darkness I had once escaped but would never completely understand.